Please watch the video until the end. What you hear last will be the echo that lingers longest. Chapter 1. The Quiet That Followed. My name is Lila Moreno. Once I believed the city was a machine that hummed predictably. Trains, taxis, laughter, the metallic click of commerce. Then the hum changed. Not louder, not sudden, but a shift in tone. An animal undertone threaded through the familiar noise. A frequency that made the hairs at the base of my neck stand up. I first noticed it after the eradication project finished. The televised parades of triumph by the agencies, the stern speeches about safety. That is when the quiet settled in. A thin, waiting hush like breath held in a crowded tunnel. I used to study insects. Not as a hobbyist, but because I believed in small things solving big problems. We engineered a predator to fix an ecological disaster. A brilliant compromise between biology and necessity. It ate the infestation, it did what we asked. And then it learned to eat silence. Chapter 2. When you teach a predator. The creatures were not monstrous at first. They were precise, efficient, something like what nature might have designed if it were pragmatic, and pragmatic to a fault. We named them silvers in lab notes. Silver for the sheen beneath their wings, and because someone in procurement liked poetic labeling. They were introduced into the basements and old ventilation shafts of the city to eat the carriers of a disease that had been ravaging children. Our models suggested a short, controlled lifespan and a rapid return to equilibrium. The models were wrong. They adapted faster than our simulations could account for. Their larvae developed resistance not only to our pesticides but to hunger. When prey was scarce, they turned their foraging to whatever made noise and movement. The lab director argued that sounds mimic prey signatures, and the silver's auditory acuity put them at a cruel advantage in a city that never sleeps by sound. I tried to leave then. I wanted to stop the distribution when the field data first showed odd behavior. Nests in subway access panels, patterns of scavenging in abandoned storefronts. But bureaucracy is a tide. Once paperwork is signed, it pulls you along. And once you touch a living thing that can evolve, you do not get to choose the consequences. Chapter 3. The Missing. People began to vanish. At first it was easy to explain. Debt, choice, a new life elsewhere. Then there were children taken from playground swings. A woman who disappeared in broad daylight between two buses. The media called it urban attrition, and my colleagues called it statistical noise. I knew the truth because I knew what their burrows looked like. The thin sheets of silk they wove in the hidden corners, the way their breathing mixed with the city's exhaust. I started seeing the imprints of their hunts. A smear on a grate, a cluster of tiny molts under a bench, the faintly oxidized smell of iron on the air after the rain. The silvers had learned to mimic something more complex than prey. The cadence of human steps, fragments of voice, the hesitations of a lover calling from the dark. They practiced these patterns until they could thread themselves into a crowd unnoticed, then strike when a gap opened. My brother Mateo stopped answering his phone. He worked nights doing maintenance in the older lines. When I rode the subway to the access he'd frequented, there were signs of occupation. A child's shoe, a scrap of a coat, smeared footprints leading down a service stair. I followed them because asking questions had become the only honest thing left to do. Chapter 4. The Descent. You do not prepare for tunnels the way you prepare for forests. There are no sunlight models to guide you, no smell of leaves. The tunnel breathes diesel and damp. My flashlight cut a small corona of daylight. Everything else was the dark business of things learning to be human. I found nests tucked into abandoned vending machines, grown into fibrous lattices that sounded when the air passed through them. The silvers had an odd taste for mimicry that went beyond sound. They adopted the pauses in human speech, the microtremors of a hand reaching for a pocket, the rhythm of a heartbeat at rest. Their success was not in brute force but in patience and imitation. They learned how to be expected and then they became the expectation. One nest particularly caught my attention. A chamber lined with discarded toys, a circle of empty baby bottles, and at its center a figure draped in a coat, unmoving. I approached thinking it was a preserved trophy. The coat twitched with a practiced, almost theatrical cough, a mimicry glitch. When the head turned, its face was a map of insect carapace and human skin, eyes threaded like pools that reflected me back with an intelligence that felt borrowed. It opened its mouth in a way that tried to copy my voice. Chapter 5. The Hunt at the Junction. I did not scream. Screaming in that light would have been a call to arms. Instead I moved, relying on the fact that I knew their blind spots, the way they favored echoing corridors where their sound mimicry worked best. I set small traps of noise. A radio left on the bench, the recorded cry of a stray dog. They came like a congregation when they heard it. First a rustling, then a slide of limbs, then whole bodies pouring through service doors. They were faster than the models and uglier than the reports. They had joints where elbows should not be, mandibles hidden beneath lips that could smile, and their singing was an archive of the voices they had stolen. At the junction of 3 tunnels I cornered a pair. One of them used a voice my brother often used to call me. The other moved with the rhythm of Mateo's walk. I fired a flare, not to hurt them but to scatter them into light for the cameras I hoped to bring. The flare set one nest alight, and for a moment their mimicry fell away. In the rawness of the flames, I saw not menace but a terrible economy. Larvae writhing, a communal intelligence rewiring in panic. They were not just predators. They were a collective remembering of every sound ever made in the places they inhabited. Chapter 6. The Toll of Knowing. In the aftermath, the city staged its rituals. Investigations, closed lines, statements read from podiums. I testified in a room smelling faintly of coffee and disinfectant. My words were translated into neutral phrasing, unforeseen adaptive behaviors, ecological drift, containment breach. They wanted numbers. I wanted my brother back. The Silvers adapted to our gestures. They learned when it was safe to hide and when to appear as lamplight and footsteps. They hid in shadowed alcoves and mimicked grief itself to lure anyone who stopped to offer comfort. People call them monsters, but monsters imply malice as a motive. These creatures were survival writ small and ruthless. I found one last nest months later in a forgotten atrium above an abandoned department store, a cathedral of silk. There were no bodies there, only echoes and dolls turned inward like sleeping birds. A child's voice whispered Lila. One of their sounds folded into memory, and for a breath I thought I heard the brother I lost. Instead, the wind moved through the lattice and made the nest sing, a chorus of borrowed syllables. Chapter 7. What We Carry. I could have left the city then, the same way I might walk away from a house after a ghost story. But leaving felt like telling a story mid-sentence. Instead I stayed and mapped, not to control but to understand. There are lessons in their mimicry. About the ease with which we teach systems to solve our problems without teaching them limits. About the terrible competence of adaptation when we are careless. If you listen now, on a night when the trains are late and the station is full of waiting, you might hear them. 3 beats behind a footstep, like a throat clearing, a lull in a child's cry that is just a breath in the wrong place. They are not everywhere and they are not invincible. But they are patient. They remember the sounds we make and the gaps we leave. They move into those gaps and wait. I record this not to stir fear but to warn and to mourn. If you ever find yourself in a quiet tunnel and someone calls your name from behind you in your own voice, do not turn too quickly. The silence after a word can be louder than any voice. Please subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, give the video a like, leave a comment with your theory and share the video with someone who loves a good scare.